Hello and welcome to another Python food tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to make a more complicated plugin. Now because of the nature of the plugin, I'm not going to get you to create this with me line by line. I've had a couple of attempts at this tutorial so far and I've tried going through that method and explaining my thinking behind the processes that I went through, and they've just turned into these massive sprawling tutorials that go on forever. And if you've watched any of my other tutorials, you'll know that even on a good day I tend to go on forever. So you can take my word for it that you do not want to see me when I am just rambling on and on and on. Anyway, the effect that we're going to be going for is actually an effect that I made a tutorial for 5 years ago. So before you watch this video all the way through, it might be worth going back and just watching this Gimp tutorial Lomo Effect 1. I think I originally thought I was going to do another Lomo Effect tutorial and then I never did, so that's why there's a 1 there. There isn't a Lomo Effect 2. But if you watch this video, it will show you the steps that you go through manually to create the effect that we're going to make a plugin for. So it might be worth watching this video and then writing down the steps that you see me take, because that would be the kind of thing that would end up in your comments in your code. So there's the video. I'll put a link to it in the description of this video. Just to show you what the effect actually looks like, we go to Filters and Lomo, and then it creates this kind of Lomograph effect. This was, like I said, this was 5 years ago, before we were just calling this an Instagram filter, when we were actually talking about lomography. But anyway, old school. So we're looking at making this plugin. Now for this plugin to work, when I first started making this plugin, you've got to believe me when I say I had no idea what I was doing. I'm still a relative beginner when it comes to Gimp scripting. But the reason I say that is because even though it was a very steep learning curve for me, the principle behind how I made it is exactly the same for the other stuff that I've shown you so far. It's a little bit more complicated, but the thinking behind it was exactly the same. So this is the actual code that we're going to have. So look, this might look very unintelligible to begin with. So what we'll do, we'll look at it line by line, and I'll explain a little bit of what's going on, just so you can kind of see the bits that you already recognize. So let's just, we'll get this out of the way to begin with. Here we've got the definition of our actual function. This should be straightforward and simple enough, and we can see, mercifully, that this only takes the image and the drawable. So we're not going to need to create anything difficult in the parameters section or anything like that. So we already know that this is going to be a reasonably simplistic program that doesn't require any user input. We can go down to the register just to see what that looks like, and look at this. It's a nice short register, nothing threatening about this at all. So we've got the name of the plugin, we've got the short description of it, the long description, we've got our copyright information, we've got the menu item as it will appear in there, the type of image that it works on, so again just RGB. We don't need to mess around with any parameters. You don't need to hear me say the word tuples in this video, and we've got our menu location for it as well. So image filters, that's where you saw me get that. So all of that stuff, that should be familiar to you. There's nothing too scary so far. But when it came to the other stuff, I'll just point out some other stuff you already know. You know this one as well. You know about group start for undo, and you know an undo group end. So again, lovely stuff we already know. So simple. There's only really this block of code here, and I say that as though that's going to be of some comfort to you. Anyway, so when we make the Lomo effect, there's a couple of things we do. We open up curves. We create that lovely S curve for the red and the green channel, and for the blue channel we create an inverted S curve. Then we create a new layer. We set that to opacity. We set the opacity mode, or to overlay mode, I should say. And then on that overlay moded layer, we use the blend tool to provide a gradient in the background, and then that gives us that kind of bleeding in of that washed out effect that just playing with the curves alone gives us. And we merge those layers and then it's done. So that's all we need to do. There's really only 3 steps to what we're doing. It's the S curves, the new layer, and then the merging of those layers. So that's it, 3 steps in our algorithm. That's all we need to worry about. So to break each of those 3 steps up, I'll show you what it looks like in the menus, because that's probably the best place to look first. So if we were to go to curves, and then for the red channel, for example, we can just pull the red line up here and then down here. We do the same with the green, so we just follow the same shape. And then for the blue one, we're going to basically do it in the opposite direction. So something like, now you've got to imagine, like, how is the GIMP going to manipulate that stuff just using code? The first thing we really need to look at is we try and take note of as much information as we can. Now, you probably notice as I move this cursor around, I've got an X and a Y axis that are moving around. So given that I'm defining some points on a line, it's a good idea to write those coordinates down, because it's very likely that we're going to need to pass those in. So the coordinates that we've got here, we've got the 0, 0 point, we've got a 92 by 63, we've got a 161 by 189, and then on the other line we've got similar coordinates. Now it's just worth pointing out as well that the kind of maximum resolution of this is 255 by 255, and it also starts at 0. So what we've actually got are 256 possible values, and we can see that they're divided into eighths as well because of these 8 overlays. So basically each one of these lines represents 32 pixel points, or coordinate points. So this actually, that number is a little bit off. If I wanted to get that perfectly, it would actually be, say, 96 by 64, because we'd be 32 by 3 and then 32 by by 3 and then by 2. So those kind of more precise coordinates are the ones I actually use in my code. It usually doesn't matter because we're only talking about very small degrees of change. Anyway, so if I were to write down those particular coordinates, they're something I'm going to be able to use later. And I can also remember that I need to keep a note of the channels that I'm using as well, the red, the green and the blue. Now I'll just cancel out of that because I don't need to do anything with that at the moment. If I open up the console and then the browser window, and then we'll just type in curves and see what we've got. We've got 2 options for curves. We've got GIMP Curves Explicit and GIMP Curves Spline. Now when I first came upon this, I didn't know what was what. I didn't know which one was going to be the one I needed to use. So I had to read the parameters very carefully just to kind of look for some clues, look for the sort of things that I could use. Reading through this channel information is a good sign, because I know I'm going to need to be able to manipulate the red, the green and the blue channels. So that looks like this is moving in the right direction. But when it comes to num bytes and curve, I know that an array is a list, just something I happen to know, and it says it's the explicit curve, so maybe I'm going to be using my those coordinate points in some way to kind of draw out the curve using a list. But for this num bytes, I've no idea what that means. It says the number of bytes in the new curve, and it says it's always 256, but I don't know what to do with that information. So this one kind of scares me a little bit. That's why I didn't pick that one. This one isn't much better, but it just seems a little bit more user-friendly from my end. The channel information appears to be the same. The number of points, well, I know there are going to be points along that line, and it says it's going to be somewhere between 4 and 34, so I can work with those numbers. And it also says the spline control points, so that kind of curvy line that we draw, the control points for that are again in an array, but this one kind of shows me the format a little bit more easily. I've got CP1, so control point 1 on the x-axis, and control point 1 on the y-axis, control point 2 on the x, control point 2 on the y, and so on. And I can put in as many of those as I need, or so it seems. So that was enough information for me to think that GIMP Curve Spline was the one I might use. So you can see when I put that in my code, that is the one I went with. I went with GIMP Curves Spline. Now, I'll just get rid of this confusing information for a second, just to show you the code. So we'll just focus on this line here. We've got the drawable layer, which is just being passed in from here, so we don't have to worry about that. I can say that I'm working on the histogram red channel, and then I know that I need to give it the number of points, and I need to give it the coordinates that also suggest an S-curve. Okay, so I knew that that was the information I was missing. I didn't know what the number of points was. I didn't know how to draw an S-curve, but I did have the coordinates written down for an S-curve. So I'll just go back. So you can see the way I built my S-curve I've got here. Each pair represents a coordinate using an X and a Y axis. Okay, so these are the numbers we had to begin with. We had 0, 0 because if you remember from the curves, there is actually a point that starts here on 0, 0, and there is a point that finishes up here on 255. So I included those. I've got those there, 0, 0, and 255, 255. Now I only put 2 extra points in, as you can see there, 96, 64, and 160, 192. But I've also got this midpoint. Because it passes through the center, I thought it would help to include that center point as well, just so the GIMP had one more value to work with, that was a little bit more precise. I fiddled around with a few different settings, and actually including that one did help in the end. Okay, so what that gives us is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points. Okay, so it gave us 5 points, but when I put in the number of points for 5, it didn't actually represent the number, the curve in the way that it did when I did it freehand, when I did it manually. So I tried 5 first, and 5 didn't give me the effect I wanted. So then I just used the next logical idea, thinking that this actually has 10 figures in it, so maybe the number of points is 10. And when I tried 10, 10 did work. So I used that code, the S-curve, to fill in the control points variable for this particular method, and then I used the number of points based on the number that I'd put in this list. Now all of this was guesswork, but I tried a few different things. I had to use trial and error, and basically once I'd tried a few things, there was a logic to it that I could see, so I knew I was on the right track eventually. And then for the inverted S-curve, on the blue channel, we do the same thing, but instead of having the S-curve, we just have an inverted S-curve. And to invert the S-curve, all I had to do was swap those points over, so the X and the Y axis were swapped, and do the same over here. Just swap the X and the Y axis. So the 160 became 192, and the 96 became 64, and so on. Okay, and then obviously the 128s were the same because that's still the center, and the beginning and the end were still the same because we didn't actually flip the curve completely. So that information, it took a lot of trial and error to get there, but it was actually quite simple. So hopefully when you read that, you can see what's going on. Now the next challenge was to add a new layer and to set it to overlay. Now this again took a lot of trial and error because there's a lot of different options for layers, and they're not necessarily that straightforward. So what I had to do first was create a variable that was a layer. This command here, gimp layer new, doesn't create a layer and put it straight into the image. It just creates a layer and it holds the idea of that layer in the GIMP's memory, which sounds a little bit confusing, but if you think of the layer as kind of being something that the GIMP is thinking of producing, but it hasn't actually put it down on paper yet, it hasn't made it happen. But you have to set it up with all of its parameters first. So we create the layer, so in the future we can just refer to it as layer, and GIMP will know it's the one that it's thinking of, if you think of it that way. And it had these options for, it needed a width, it needed a height, it needed a mode, it needed an image mode, it needed an overlay mode, it needed an opacity level, and it needed, it needed a label, is this one, this overlay, and then the overlay mode is the kind of adjustment layer mode. So it needed all of those pieces of information. Image.width is obviously me referring to GIMP.foo's internal information to say, well, whatever size the image actually is, that's the size of the layer I want. So it's easy to pull those pieces of information in using dot notation. and the opacity I set to 100. I just wanted to write opacity 100 so that this wasn't a magic number. You know, I could have just had this as 100, but as I've said previously, when you come back to this 3 months later, it doesn't mean anything to you. So I try wherever possible to use a variable, even if it's something as simple as setting the opacity to 100. I can say opacity 100 equals 100, and then I can throw that variable in there. It makes it nice and readable. So that created the idea of the layer. Then I needed to create a layer position. So that is, if you imagine on the layer window on the right hand side, you'll remember that layers have positions. Okay, so this is position 1, this is position 2, this is position 3. But because computers start counting at 0, this is actually position 0, position 1, position 2. So if we have a layer that we've already created, and then we add a new layer on top of that, and it needs to be on top because we want the adjustment mode to be overlay, then we need to make sure that when we drop that layer, we drop it into the first position, into that 0 position. So I knew I was going to need a layer position because when we actually insert the layer, which is a separate function, then we can insert the image, the layer that we made up here, and the layer position, which is 0. Now this one here, this none, I should just quickly point that out to you because this caused me quite a bit of confusion as well. In fact, this took me a number of hours to figure out. This was probably the most frustrating part of the whole script. So if we look at the parameters for the GIMP image insert layer, we have this layer information called the parent layer. Now, I knew that I wasn't creating a parent layer, so I knew there wasn't a parent layer. Reading the additional information told me that if the parent is 0, which is what I thought was true of my image, then the layer added inside the main stack is outside of any group. Okay, so basically we're not talking about grouped layers, we're talking about layers that are just, you know, separate of themselves, which was how I was creating my layers. So that was straightforward enough. So I knew that basically I was going to have to say that the parent layer was 0 because there wasn't a parent layer. However, and this is the thing that tripped me up, when I kept putting 0 in here, it didn't work. I tried it lots of different ways. I was Googling around forever to try and find it. There wasn't really that much specific information about it. But this is a difference between Scheme, the original programming language that a lot of script foo was originally written in, and a difference between Scheme and Python. Scheme accepts a 0 value, whereas Python wants you to call that value none. So every now and again, you'll come across very small inconsistencies. Every now and again, you'll come across very small inconsistencies where the behavior of Scheme is different to the behavior of Python, but they haven't necessarily documented the Pythonic expression that they want you to give. The most obvious example of that is the underscore versus the hyphen, and that catches you out every now and again. But sometimes you'll get other ones that really kind of throw you a curveball. So this was one that I found. I found it just by pouring through a ton of forums and that kind of thing. And that's all you can try, really. That's just an element of trial and error. But once you get to it, hopefully it will work. So once I'd fixed that up, it was actually a very straightforward line of code. So we create the layer up here, or we create the idea of the layer up here. We create a layer position for it, so we don't have a magic number here. And then we have the line of code that inserts that layer into the image. Okay, so hopefully that will make sense so far. Okay, so we've done our curves, we've done our new layer, and then the final thing we needed to do was add that blend gradient. Now to do the blend gradient, what I've got up here are a whole bunch of variables so that I don't have magic numbers in the code. Okay, so I'll just get rid of the variables for the moment because they can be off-putting and a bit scary. Here's the line of code. Okay, so I did a search in the procedure browser for blend. We had GIMP edit blend, that sounded good. There were a few different options. I just went with GIMP edit blend because it seemed like it was the most readable when I had examined all of them. Now we can see that we get a paint mode. Now actually when I discovered the paint mode, I realized that I probably didn't have to make that new layer at all. I probably could have just done a blend straight over the image and set the paint mode to overlay. But anyway, you only learn these things in hindsight, and I didn't bother changing it afterwards, and I haven't tested it to find out if that was true, because it would have been heartbreaking. So anyway, I knew that the blend I was doing was going to be in foreground, background, RGB mode, because when I looked at the blend options, that was how it was set. So we had, you can see down here, it says foreground to background. I know I've got a linear shape, so all of my information is kind of given to me down here. So I knew I was working in foreground to background mode, so we can call that foreground background RGB mode, or we can just say 0 in the code, but you know my preference for readability, so I'm going to use this one. I ended up making this one in normal mode because it is on its own adjustment layer, so I didn't have to put it to overlay mode. But like I said, that would have been a good option if I just not put the code in for the new layer. I also knew I was going to need a gradient type. Well, as I said from down here, I know that the shape of the gradient is linear, and I've got an option for gradient linear up here, so that's good. I've got an option for opacity. That's a nice easy thing. I know it takes a floating point number, and I know I want it to be seen, so it's probably going to be 100. It's completely opaque. There was an offset. Now, I didn't know what this meant necessarily. I mean, I know offset usually means, how far offset from the original starting point are you going to run this thing, essentially. I just assumed that my offset would be 0. I used that and it worked, so I didn't have to worry about that too much. I didn't change any of the repeat function stuff, so I could see down here that repeat says none, so I just put repeat none. I didn't reverse the gradient because I wanted it to go in the direction that I set it to, so I just said false. I didn't know what to do with super sampling, but you can see down here it says adaptive super sampling is off, so again that's probably false. Maximum depth, I didn't know what to do with the depth, so I just set it to 1, I think. I think I just put in the kind of minimum value. I think that worked. And again, for things like the threshold and dithering, I either used the information that was down here, so dithering was ticked, so I said dithering was true. And for the threshold, I just put in 0, I think, as a minimum value. And then I had the starting point for the blend and the ending point for the blend, and those were X and Y coordinates for the start and end point. And those are X and Y coordinates that exist on our image. So all of that's quite a lot of information to take in, but that's how we put that in here, okay? So I've just got my layer, my blend mode, my paint mode, my gradient type, and you can see that I'm not putting the actual values in here because I don't like magic numbers. So I tried to make this code as readable as possible, so seeing that, hopefully you can understand what's going on. You can see all of the decisions that have to be made, all of the information that has to be accounted for, and then when I put the actual numbers in, I just used the various codes that were required. So blend mode was 0 because blend mode 0 was the first option. The paint mode was 0 because that's the normal. Gradient type was linear. The offset was 0. Repeat was 0. The reverse was false. The super sample was false. Dither was true. Threshold 0. So all of that stuff. The only thing that's a little bit different to what you might usually expect was this section here, where I had, instead of giving an actual x-axis and y-axis value, I used the width as provided by Gimp like the stored internal information. Because obviously I want this to work on every image that I use. I don't just want to make it work on something that happens to be 544 by 407 pixels. So when I said I want it to start in this corner up here and go to the middle, which was what I ended up choosing, I couldn't use the values that show up in the pixels down here. I couldn't hard code those values in because on another image those pixels would be in a different place. They might be non-existent pixels. So you need to account for the fact that you don't want to put in a hard-coded value, you want to put in the relative position. Okay, so I want it to start in the top right-hand corner, So the top right hand corner, because the coordinates are flipped on the axes as well, so 0 is in the top right hand corner instead of the bottom left hand corner. So for it to be in the top right, and you can see I've put it in the code here, I have the width of the layer. So to be on the x-axis at the rightmost point, it's basically 544 is 544 down here in the little pixel numbers window is over here. Okay, so the width of the layer is also the final position of the pixel point, if that makes sense. Similarly, the one for the center is going to be exactly half of the width of the image and half of the height of the image, because it's going to come in exactly half of each of those values and then will be in the center. So to get the layer width divided by half, I just say layer width divided by 2, layer height divided by 2. Very, very simple maths. That's about as difficult as most of the maths gets in the GIMP, unless you start doing really crazy effects, which we are not doing. And then the final thing we had to do once we'd set that was merge all the visible layers. So we just say layer, we establish a new value for that layer, and we basically say merge all visible layers, image, and 0, and I'll just show you what the 0 accounts for because I've left a magic number in there. Okay, so usually whenever I merge my layers, I expand as necessary, so that 0 just means expand as necessary. So it's bad practice of me to leave that as a 0, but I think I was probably, spent long enough on this code, so I was over it. So anyway, then that's it. Then you have the image undo group at the end. So that's a lot of talking and not as much kind of practical hands-on stuff for you, but hopefully you can understand that coming up with these values up here wasn't an arbitrary decision. I had to go back to the procedure browser and look up what kind of values I was looking for, had to look very carefully at the dialog boxes I was using, and I had to use a lot of intuition and trial and error. And really, intuition and trial and error are the thing that are going to help you in the early days, because you won't know how to use every thing. A lot of this can be like quite arcane, difficult, obtuse language. Sometimes there's some mistranslations between Scheme and Python. But if you use that idea of just carefully thinking through your options, you'll get there in the end. So anyway, this is a very wordy tutorial. I'm not sure how helpful it's been, but hopefully you've been able to get something out of it. In the next tutorial, which will be the final tutorial in this series, I'm going to show you how to modify this Lomo effect further so that we actually allow some user input. But I'll explain that in the next video because this one's been going long enough. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.